So yeah, let's get into this here. 2001.
Okay, so the original novel written by Arthur C. Clarke.
Okay. Yeah, and that's one thing that I always tend to. I know Arthur C. Clarke. I've as a science fiction writer, but that's one thing. Like I think the movie has the more fame maybe than necessarily the book does. So I think that's one thing that I always overlook too. I forget that it originally was a novel first.
Well, Kubrick is very notorious for going off book from things that he adapts. So he's done it a couple times. He did it with this, he did it with A Clockwork Orange, and he did it with The Shining, are like the three most notable.
Okay.
But the original novel by Arthur C. Clarke in 1948 is almost nothing like what this movie is.
Okay.
It is drastically altered from what was written. And I think this is one of the few cases where that really worked.
Okay. Do you think did he have a hard time then getting it made? Did like Clarke object?
Well, no, because he's also he was a smart businessman. He acquired the necessary rights to do that kind of thing when he needed to. So when he attacked an adaptation, he made sure he locked up the legalities of being able to do that, so that even if there was a disparage and somebody had a problem with it, he basically could do it anyway.
It to work. Okay. Yeah, I got you.
And that actually got him into quite a lot of trouble with Stephen King on The Shining. King actually vividly despises Kubrick's take on The Shining.
Future episode, ladies and gentlemen.
Yeah, nudge, nudge, wink, wink. But yeah, so one of my favorite quotes and from
Chekhov's gun there for you.
Which actually in the only surprisingly enough, there's only a handful of actual interviews with Kubrick on 2001. I mean, they're out there, but you can't. There's only so I think I've heard like the same 5 or 6, a few dozen times, but I can't really find much else.
Okay.
And he's constantly brings up though that his favorite quote is one of the earliest quotes in the novel. Behind every man now alive stands 30 ghosts, for that is the ratio by which the dead outnumber the living, which I think actually impacts Kubrick's entire filmography from that point on.
Yeah, I think
he definitely took a lot away from that.
Yeah, especially in this movie in 2001, having seen it again freshly, for this, it definitely stresses that, the past and where we came from is just as important as where we are now, where we're going. And like, we have to make sure we realize that we're where we are now because of where we were.
Exactly. The past has great influence on the future.
Yeah. Absolutely, yeah.
His first big feature film being Fear and Desire in 1953, is not the one that everybody remembers. The big one that kind of really kicked his foot in the door was The Killing.
Yeah.
And I know a good few people will remember The Killing, but an easier reference point for tapping into that for people, Christopher Nolan, who is also an avid and vocal Stanley Kubrick fan, has... if you watch The Killing in conjunction with The Dark Knight's opening sequence and the third act of The Killing are extremely similar. Like there is
extremely similar
there.
Okay, so, and when would you say? So you would say that would be his.
I would say that is his first firm foot in the door in 1956.
Breakout onto the scene, or at least maybe not, at least onto the cinema scene, like in the community of filmmaking.
I mean, he had been kicking around shorts for 3 or so years before Fear and Desire in 1953, but people started taking notice of him after The Killing.
After the film, okay.
He hit an early stride with a lot of that stuff and built up to the point where you could tell 2001 was like his target he was trying to hit.
Yeah.
And everything was like building up and leading to that platform. And by the time he got to 2001, he could do anything he wanted to. And he had a lot of different ideas of where he wanted to go. But he invested a lot of time and a lot of effort whenever he made a film. He did not half-ass anything.
So could you say that like 2001, by the time that came, that was the first time he had the first time he had like maybe full control over his project? There's always the stories of newer directors, always having that watchful studio eye, but
probably the biggest example.
Okay.
Like that's the one that like just shocked the entire. Well, not shocked, but shook the entire industry into okay, this man is a force.
Yeah.
A force to be reckoned with, and it got to the point where they actually started re-screening 2001 even just a few years after that because it had such a lasting and long-term impact.
Yeah.
And I think Nolan has talked a few times. He recently, just within the last few years, he and his team took up and got a hold of all the original negatives and all the 6-track recordings for 2001 and they restored the film and regraded all the negatives, cleaned everything up, did basically the same process that was done to Jaws. Jaws was kind of like the first big restoration process. that did a cross analog digital restoration platform, and like when you buy a 4K Blu-ray or you buy a Blu-ray, like everyone's like, oh well, we have modern technology. How does that stuff? Why don't we just have everything? I'm like, well, it's kind of a big deal to like dig out all those negatives, and clean all that stuff
get
up.
them. Yeah, it's a process.
In some cases, like Jaws, it's as big of an endeavor as producing the movie itself. Like,
well, yeah, to get like, so. I mean, I assume they would have to like take all the negatives and completely and digitize them, which can take a while because it's got to go through a specific type of machine, I assume, to get it into a digital format.
And they rescanned all the originals of Jaws. Jaws is like my linchpin for restoration processes because it was kind of the first one to really get the process 100% right, in my opinion.
Yeah.
But they did a cross-digital analog process. So what that means is they both rebathed the negative to clean out scratches, clean out a lot of the impurities, but then they rescanned it also, and they used simple, simple is a bad word, but like very simple Photoshop techniques frame by frame to clean out a lot of scratches and impurities they couldn't get in the bays. So it's like you're kind of getting the best of both worlds. And then when they store it, they both store it on a server with the full high-res negative digitally, and they actually scan back out into an analog format, which they store in Universal's full big huge warehouse that they have out there that they keep everything in.
So not exactly an instantaneous process. There is
not even by the
it sounds time-consuming.
Yeah. And what I thought was interesting, anybody who's interested in Kubrick should definitely watch this documentary called Film Worker about Leon Vitali. Leon Vitali was not on the scene for 2001, but he was so fascinated by 2001 that he came drawn to Kubrick and eventually started working with him. He got a job on Barry Lyndon and worked with him on every production following that. And he actually became what a lot of people regard as the foremost expert on the man. He actually had memorized all the color timing of every print that Kubrick had ever done. He slept like almost never because he worked so many hours for Kubrick, and how that man is still alive is beyond me. He's not exactly living a lavish life of luxury. He's not, contacted by the Kubrick Foundation, at least as far as I know.
Yeah.
Because if you watch the documentary, you would understand, because it seems like he's kind of just like out of a lot of this, but he really just knows everything about the man. Like, he's a fascinating figure. He was kind of Kubrick's right hand for a lot of these projects, especially The Shining, I think, was the biggest one. I know he was integral to a lot of what went on during those years.
Interesting.
It's more power to the man.
Yeah.
Because I know I don't have the fortitude to do it. That would annihilate me.
I would have taken one look and been like, yeah. Nah.
It's like that's the point you like devote your whole life to somebody because you respect them that much as an artist, and I can only admire that kind of commitment. Like, cuz
that's basically that old swearing of an oath type deal.
Yeah. And he's also, if you've seen Eyes Wide Shut, he is the Red Cloak in the Secret Society.
Okay, I've only ever seen bits of Eyes Wide Shut.
A lot of commentary on secret societies. And
was that his last film, Eyes Wide Shut? Or?
Yeah, he actually, it's his most contested film too.
Okay,
because he died before the final edit was.
Did he really?
Composed.
I didn't. Okay.
And Kubrick was notorious for changing up the edit in like the final minutes before the deadline to distribute. Like he constantly tinkered and changed. And Leon is actually the one who finished up Eyes Wide Shut for distribution, and not everybody. Like, a lot of people thought it should have been shelved and never released because
Kubrick it didn't have that final stamp of approval on it.
Yeah, it's like it was like a half vision. A lot of people felt.
Okay,
but it's a fascinating film nonetheless. I mean, I get in a lot of ways the 2001 is it's very up for interpretation.
Yeah. So getting into 2001 here, give me the legacy of this film. Just as knowing it as much as I do, and which is not that much, but like, it's one of those that I know of, I've heard of it, I've watched it, I see, parodies of it, even sometimes when I'm not conscientious of it, but it certainly is influential on a lot of, especially to science fiction, I would say. I think a lot of people would, think science fiction, they would probably think like Star Wars or Star Trek, but this came out in terms of cinema, before Star Wars.
Yeah, and largely, THX 1138, George Lucas's. I guess it's more of a short. It's not quite a feature, but it's kind of somewhere in between. it has some clear inspiration from that because it's a little more experimental than Star Wars was. Star Wars was a bit more of an operatic, but I think Star Wars has more of the grand vision of 2001.
Yeah.
And Lucas has also been slightly vocal that yes, 2001 kicked in the door for me and made me want to do this. And it's like the two immediate obvious ones around the time that 2001 was actually released, I would say, are both George Lucas and Ridley Scott.
Okay.
Ridley Scott had the dark vision of the future, and the two big things that Ridley did that were takeoffs of 2001 in large ways were Alien and Blade Runner. And what a lot of people don't know is Alien and Blade Runner actually were designed to exist in the same universe.
Really?
So they're kind of the same, at least as I regard them.
Were they
in a lot of ways.
So were they supposed to like be like companion pieces to each other, or like
yes, in a lot, at least like not by the Phil K. Dick novel of Blade Runner, which is where the origins of all that came from, and obviously evolved largely. Blade Runner went through a hefty writing change process from book to screen.
Okay.
But yeah, Ridley has been probably next to Nolan the most vocal about being inspired. He touts his fealty to Kubrick at every turn.
the Kubrick maniac. I'm trying to come up with a term.
the Kubrick mania.
The Kubrick mania.
Planet of the Apes is also a lot of people disparage with that one because it came out in the same year.
Okay,
as 2001. So it's kind of like the chicken and the egg. All right, who thought of it?
Who came up with it first? Yeah.
Yeah. So take that one for what you will, but I do think that 20th Century Fox with Planet of the Apes was trying to catch up to MGM's high caliber with 2001.
Yeah.
But Planet of the Apes is a fantastic film and should not be merely sloughed off as living in the shadow of 2001. Also, like a lot of things, basically 2001 kicked in the door for miniature work because a lot of people didn't think of merging sets with the wide scale in the same way that they did after Kubrick really kicked in that door.
Yeah, having watched that opening again, I have to say it still holds up, and I was like, man, how did they do this in the 60s without any computer technology, at least not to the extent that we have today?
It was one of the first really like wide CinemaScope examples of effective rear screen projection. What rear screen projection is, basically you have a white screen that you're projecting into from behind and you're recording from in front. So it's like a 4-tier process where you have actors, lighting, projection, camera going on all within the same frame. And at the time that they did this, was made for an incredibly hot and toasty set. And when you have a bunch of actors in full ape makeup, God help you.
Yeah. And what would have been, so like doing that was a complete shift in like what the normal process would have been on set? Like if this would have been shot, like what would have been like the standard then instead of...
The way that this would have been executed before this, they would have had to have gotten on location.
Okay.
And shot this stuff but then you're dealing with shifting daylight.
Yeah.
When you have this much stuff to set up at the time, it just wasn't even remotely, you couldn't even remotely wrap your head around something like that with the tech of the time. So Kubrick just kind of stepped a foot in and started doing things a little differently. And you have to also think, this seems very commonplace now. It's like, okay, yeah, we deal with green screen and stuff on a common basis, but this was massively ahead of it. At least was like decades ahead of its time at the very least. And it took people years to fully wrap their heads around it and understand exactly what he did.
Yes.
He changed the game forever.
Yeah.
A lot of the space visuals too. I mean, you have to keep in mind this was in 1968. We hadn't really seen the Earth from space yet.
Yeah, no, because it's a year before the official moon landing.
Yeah. And that also draws in, a lot of people have the conspiracy theory that he was called in by the government to help fake the moon landings.
Yes, I've heard this, to fake the moon landing.
And I mean, yeah, again, take that for whatever grains of salt you can, because it's, as they say, kooky talk.
Well, I've heard too with that, they say it's like it would have been easier to actually go to the moon than it would have cost to actually fake it. So I just think that's interesting, that it would have been more difficult to fake the moon landing than actually just go to the moon.
And also, as you can see, I mean, Kubrick certainly got some things wrong. In his depiction of the Earth from 2001, you can't see any of the continents. You can't, everything is just cloud wisps and this bluish white haze. It's just...
And do you think that was maybe sort of like something he just had to settle with because of the technology at the time. He just kind of
I
had
think
to.
it was just a limited understanding because I mean, again, we hadn't seen it and we
True.
didn't know it for
Yeah.
definitive fact what these things looked like, and the man was playing his best guess.
Yeah.
And I mean, in the same way that Blade Runner got some things wrong, got a hell of a lot right about the future.
Yeah.
I mean, you got to admire the man for taking the shot and hit. He while he didn't necessarily hit the bullseye. And this is the age old question too. It's like, okay, did he actually see that far ahead, or did this movie gain so much of a prolific nature that it actually influenced the future and guided it more towards? Because I mean, let's face it, 2001 accurately predicts the iPad as being a thing.
Yeah.
So
yeah, no, it does. At least maybe not. It might not look to what we would accustom it to.
Yeah, but I mean, it's still like.
But it still is the same, yeah.
They didn't even the home computer wasn't even really thought of yet. I mean, and he's already thinking ahead to iPad. Like
even the idea
tablets.
of like, I think even with everything going on now, I can't remember the first character we see in the future, who comes up to the space station and he sends out a call to talk to his daughter on video. Obviously the machine itself, and the way that
is more robust.
Yeah, and might not look as what we would see today, but still, the idea, the principle to know that
for 1968,
to know that like this is where technology is going to go, and like now today it's being used, especially now, everyone's using this idea of
commonplace stuff for us. We don't even think twice about it.
Yeah, so that's a good point. Like, did it influence it a little bit, or was that something that he and the people who worked on it were able to just sort of glean from the data that they had at hand at the time?
It's a little bootstrap paradoxy for you.
Yeah,
the chicken and the egg. But, yeah, I mean, then you also got Gene Roddenberry with Star Trek. James Cameron hasn't been quite so vocal, but you can see trends in his movies that definitely, like, he at the very least learned technicals from 2001, because it does a lot of, Terminator thematically.
Oh yeah,
the fear of how AI taking over. It's like he's just expounding on that idea into a full war front versus it being just a simple confrontation, philosophical differences between man and his creation. Titanic also kind of pushed things forward on the concept of using miniatures, different frame rates to shoot miniatures so that they seamlessly intersect with on-set footage, and that's how they really faked it and made it look like you're seeing this giant ship sink into the water surrounded by a ton of people. I mean, obviously that didn't shoot that optically, but they learned the principles and expounded upon it and really brought that stuff home. And then also, his work on The Abyss. Again, the themes of contacting a greater intelligence, reaching beyond man's grasp and seeing an entity, for lack of a better explanation, because the monolith of 2001 is this designed to be incomprehensible entity. It's not spoon-fed to you whether or not it's an evolution of mankind. Is it aliens? It's meant to be this literally a black box of like fill it with what you will. Like,
yeah, it's almost like that. I've always taken it as kind of like a Pandora's box type thing. You could attribute it to that, but I'm pretty sure it's open to your interpretation, and I'm assuming that's what he was going for.
That's what I think is so genius. So many people get so many different things out of it, and I've had a lot of conversations with people where I've dredged up things I never even thought of, and I'm like, oh my gosh, it's like the deeper you dig, the more you find, and it's like this never-ending cycle of themes and stuff, because it really leaves it up to the audience to fill it with what you will.
Yeah, which is, I think, is interesting, because when I was watching it again, that opening sequence, there is not one piece of dialogue in that opening sequence.
For the longest
time.
time.
The Dawn of Man sequence. It's all just, unless you, of course, you consider, the primitive man yelling at each other, but they're not really saying anything, or at least not that we can understand.
It's largely a commentary on man's grasp with tools, because for all intensive purposes, Hal is a tool, but he transcends being a tool into being an entity.
Yeah.
And that is a pivot point in mankind's rule over what he thought he dominated over.
Yeah.
Man kind of rescinds back into being the childlike figure. It's like we start off being the child who gains an understanding of how to use a tool, and then we grow as a species, and then our tool grows beyond us.
Yeah,
and it's like the shifting sands of how all that changes.
It's kind of that the creation growing beyond the creator type thing a little bit. You could argue, like, I think of like almost like I don't know if like the themes of like Frankenstein or something would come into that to play,
Yeah, big time.
Because it's, again, essentially the creature sort of comes after him then, in a way.
Yeah.
But yeah, that was interesting, that opening sequence. Just from like, if you were trying to market that today as a movie, I feel especially like
I don't believe that this movie would ever get made.
well, I just
Not
find
in
it
a
so
million
interesting because,
years.
like I said, I'm pretty sure as I was watching it, I like checked the time code. I don't think it's until like almost a half hour in that you get a piece of dialogue, and it's pretty much just
Yeah.
a tone set up. It's just him, the character's name. I always forget the character's name. I've already forgotten it. But him coming off the ship onto the space station. That's the first set of dialogue in there. But the rest of it is all pretty much, old school filmmaking, just using images and like, music if you got it.
And largely cryptic too.
Yeah.
It's real. A lot of it is just there to set a tone and to set an atmosphere, and also how mankind withholds from itself.
Yeah.
Like we hold secrets. We compartmentalize. That nobody know. Like they don't talk about what's going on with the monolith to really anybody, and it's this big, large scale secret.
Yeah.
And he's like, well, that's all I'm really authorized
To say, yeah.
Kind of a lot of themes kicking back and forth about how man is his own worst enemy and he's standing in his own way. I think there's a lot to be gained from this movie, and it's somewhere in between being education and entertainment.
Yeah, and its influences. So what other keeping on with the influences here? You were talking about The Abyss.
I think that The Abyss is one of Cameron's more fascinating films. It's one of the ones that he definitely loves more than I think a lot of moviegoers have over the years. But I think that it sits in a category for me with The Thing, kind of, but it's like contact with another species, but like it's not. It ends on a hopeful tone, which I've always found fascinating about that movie, because 2001 also does, and on a hopeful tone, despite all the creepiness and all the haunting nature of everything that you put through in that movie. It really does leave you on a hopeful tone that mankind is headed towards something different or something better, and that life will continue on. And it's just, but it again, and it lives in that incomprehensibility.
Yeah,
that's meant to challenge you.
Exactly.
So it leaves you in a strange existential funk in a way, but one that I think does you a service.
Yeah, and I think thinking of The Abyss too, just like the technical challenge of making that movie, because I know they shot a lot of it underwater, in a tank. So it's almost like you figure, or sometimes someone trying to make.
It's also one of the first big examples of computer effects being utilized in movies.
Yeah.
I mean, what was the first one of that? Terminator was shortly thereafter that they did Terminator 2 with the same kind of tech, but they were molding it into reflective surfaces.
Yeah.
So Cameron was pushing with ILM pretty heavily on that kind of button and trying to develop that, and he certainly pushed things forward, which I've always found interesting, because Terminator 2 is like one of the hardcore vestiges of an action film using practical effects.
Mm-hmm.
Which is ironic, because it's also one of the earliest and biggest examples of introducing computer effects. So it's this weird enigma for me. But and like unquestionable, like the parallels between all three of those that I mentioned to 2001. If you're looking for them enough, you'll find them. But I mean, again, up to interpretation.
Yeah. And what other, any other big name influences still to this day?
I would bring up Fincher, but not necessarily specifically in the tone of 2001. There's a lot of content creators that I attribute to being children of Kubrick, who are taking a lot of expounding on his philosophy and way of doing things in different areas. So it's almost like they chopped him up into pieces, and everybody took their share and ran with it in different directions. One of the big ones that I always come back to is Wes Anderson. Wes Anderson has a way of shooting that is very reminiscent, cinematography wise, if nothing else, of Kubrick, and just like the creepy symmetry. He effectively uses symmetry to unsettle his audience in a great way, I think. David Fincher shoots everything from a behavioral perspective. Like all his cinematography and all of his editing styles are 100% centered around the behavior of his actors and his characters, and everything flows out of that and how they behave and their interactions with one another. If you watch, everything is hands, everything is action, everything is eye lines. There's 1,000 breakdown videos out there of Fincher's style and how he really does not have any fat on the meat, so to speak. He really just gets into exactly what's happening and what you need to know in that situation. And Kubrick was very much in that same arena. So again, that was kind of the chunk that Fincher took and ran with, I think. So, but I think above all the rest, and by far the most vocal about it, would be Chris Nolan. I mean, he directly utilized the centrifuge for Inception.
And what is the centrifuge for those if you've never seen 2001 or?
So as it sits in 2001, The large spinning rings on the ship that David is running around for his calisthenics, his cardio in the morning. They actually built that ring into a steel structure that was motorized to spin the entire set on itself continuously, and they very carefully choreographed that sequence so he's constantly running in the low gravity portion of the centrifuge, and he's constantly on the ground. The set's really just moving around him as he's running.
Moving, yeah.
And the camera is just fixed and built into the top of the centrifuge and just keeps coming past him.
That just sounds like a production nightmare to have to go through.
Not to mention a liability nightmare. Could you imagine trying to do that nowadays?
Well, I would imagine today, would they even unless the director wanted to, but I imagine most of the time it would just be...
Yeah, I mean, I can't even imagine the landscape that Nolan had to fight to get that... get that made for Inception. But even the anti-gravity sequence in Inception, there's another, it's a harken back again to 2001 on the ship as he's making his way to the moon installation. He has pens floating in the air, and we also see Saito in Inception in a very similar position as he's being moved through the hotel, and just like a lot of little parallels like that. Like Nolan has heavily expressed his love, and Interstellar is that entire movie is basically a love letter to 2001. I mean, it's basically just a retreading in modern science of a lot of the same visual concepts.
Yeah.
And I think the only real main difference is Interstellar is more plot driven, a little bit more grounded in reality.
Yeah.
Whereas 2001 is really chalked up there to be provocative
and more like challenging. Would you say that's accurate?
Oh, 100%.
Okay.
I mean, we're still reeling over it some 50 plus years later.
It's true, yeah.
So I don't know. It's one for the books, and I don't know. As you said, you watched it the other day. What were your big takeaways?
Honestly, now I meant to ask you, because full disclosure, Brian lent me his Voodoo to watch this.
Whoop. Sorry, Voodoo.
But yeah, having watched it again for the first time in a while, I couldn't remember that opening. Just like the first 2 minutes, it's just a blank screen and it's just the music. Was that originally there? Was that something that maybe I didn't know if I had been watching
the theatrical release? And it's
and that I think is so interesting, because as I was watching it, I'm enjoying it, and I'm like, oh man, I can imagine how much better this would be in the actual theatrical setting.
So from two perspectives, I've always found that interesting.
Yeah.
Number one, within the thematic context of the movie, it's like the darkness of the universe before the Big Bang.
Yeah.
And the title card sequence is the dawn of the universe.
Mm-hmm.
The planets, the stars, everything coming into form. So that also, I mean, the whole scope of this movie is all of existence.
Yeah.
I mean, there is no bigger concept
to
cover in terms of scope.
If you want to talk scope, I think this is as big as you can get in any story. I mean, at least that I can think of.
It's been aped before. I mean, Terrence Malick, I'm clearly in, I should have actually written this down, but didn't. Tree of Life is also very, very, it comes at a lot of the provocative nature of 2001, I think, and they actually used a lot of the Stargate sequence they used for 2001. They used cloud tank methodology they would use high values of light blasting through the bottom of an ink tank, and then they would spread different chemicals and different compounds in there to create different kinds of visuals, and that's how they made the look of the cosmos and a lot of those types of shots.
And so they're basically just shooting through like a fish
version
tank
of that same process in Tree of Life, and I've always been fascinated by both.
So wait, this cloud tank, is it essentially like is it a literal tank that they put?
It's essentially just a big fish tank, and then I emulated this process a few years ago, and it's not easy to do at all.
Okay.
You pretty much just get, for whatever chemical compound you're trying to create, you really only get one shot to get it right, and if you don't get it right, you're out gallons and gallons and gallons of water, and it's heartbreaking when you get it wrong. But yeah, so again, I can't even begin to fully grasp the widespread influence of this movie, because it goes in so many chaotic different directions, and I mean, you could really make a case for modern filmmaking hinging.
Well, yeah, and that's like you said, just getting back to that first opening thing where it's just the blank screen and it's just the rumbling of the music and the sound. I'm sitting there thinking to myself, I wonder how, if you played this, if this came out today, how long could you go, or how many times, or how often would someone be
before
like,
people walk out,
or say, hey, the projector's broken, or it's not working, or something, and it's like, that's that's the point, and that's thought of like, this is a movie that I think wants to challenge your patience, especially with the scope of it. It took a long time to get not just where we are now, but where our solar system and where life itself is at this moment. I think that's one of the things it's trying to sort of capture. Correct me if I'm wrong there.
No, you're on the money. And I also like the other point I wanted to mention was that that opening sequence of the black operatic section. It's very much like the opening of a play.
Yeah.
And Eyes Wide Shut finishes the same way, and I've always been fascinated by that. I really do think it's a bit of a love letter by Kubrick just to the theatrical experience of theater, not filmmaking, but actually going to a play.
No, that is and I think that's the one thing when you have something like that. Now, I think what's still amazing is like, I would imagine he shot all of this in a studio, did he?
A lot of it, yeah. I mean, obviously the centrifuge stuff they built on a stage. All of the interiors for the ship were built on a stage. They did a lot of helicopter photography for both the Stargate sequence and for the opening shots in the African desert.
Yeah. Were some of those like when the monolith shows up? Is that now? I was figuring that was probably on a stage. And I was like admiring that because it still looked really good, but maybe I was wrong when I was looking at it.
Yeah, still on a stage, and I think that's what makes it so impressive.
Yeah, it has that.
Is really only the landscape shots that don't even include any of the actors in suits or anything like that, or the stuff that was actually shot live, like actually out on location. It's impressive how effective he got that early on with doing that rear projection system, because it was so new on the scene, but he knew exactly how to light it and make it work.
Yeah.
And he only got better with time. And when I first found out that in Eyes Wide Shut, almost all of the street sequences were shot rear projection with Tom Cruise on a treadmill, my mind was just like shattered into pieces. I was like, I if you hadn't told me that, I would never have known it.
Wait, what is?
So there's all these long sequences in Eyes Wide Shut of Tom Cruise walking on sidewalks in downtown New York.
Okay.
And all of them were shot rear projection with him just standing on a treadmill.
Really?
He's not on the street, and if nobody, like,
I'll have to
only when you're like looking very painstakingly at those sequences can you even tell that it's not real. It's very, very tricky to pick it out, but it shattered my existence when I realized that Kubrick's a madman. But yeah.
So yeah, going more into like the, one thing I thought, even like some of the details of like, what the people are eating on the ships when he's docking into I assume is it the moon that he's docking onto?
Yeah, so they leave Earth. He leaves Earth, comes up, docks with the first station, leaves from there, heads to the moon.
Yeah.
So all of his initial conversations in the Hilton, as it's labeled all over the walls, he's on an interim station there. Then they move to the moon where he's to conduct his investigation. And
I think too, like one thing that really I'm liked about this, and this is just me, and I'm curious again. I'm wondering if like some people would not enjoy it as much as like there is just that sense of atmosphere of just taking you through what it might be like, and just even though the journey seems simple for the character at the time because I guess maybe he's used to it going into space, but just like that long journey of going from Earth to the space station, then docking to the moon. Like
that's what I think is one of the big fascinating things about it, is it makes this grandiose concept for its time of going to space, but they make it so mundane and so casual.
Yeah.
It's this normal day-to-day task for him. He's like, oh, well, just showing up to the office. Hey.
And this, of course, still is going, it's when it comes out, it's still during, the Cold War, and the space race is still...
again, before we had
been on the moon,
moon. So it only heightened that hunger, I think, for everybody to want to get there. And I mean, we had a very different view of what by this movie, but what 2001 was going to look like technologically, but at the same time we weren't completely far off either.
Yeah.
Twists the mind
slightly. No, it definitely
not even just in its grandiose philosophical concepts of what is existence, what is mankind, that kind of thing, what is intelligence, what constitutes sentience.
One thing, and and one thing too I always thought is the comparison of the reaction to the monolith composed to in the Dawn of Man to when is it David? I always want to say David. I always want to call him Hal, but Hal's that's not him. Because Hal to me is the famous, and he's the AI of it, but that's the one I remember the most out of the whole movie.
Yeah.
Even though his performance is pretty much just a red dot and a voice.
Which I think it's like the real first example hardcore of the Kubrick stare, which a lot of people will say like, okay, there's the image of Alex in Clockwork Orange with his threatening stare into the camera. It's one of the first things you see in the movie. And then there's the example in Full Metal Jacket, which is also obvious. But I mean, like, the threatening nature of Hal, I think, is quite unparalleled. Like, I mean, it's just this red dot staring
it
you
almost,
down, piercing into your soul. Like, it's just deeply unsettling.
I've always thought this too. Like, does it have, again, like, this is open to interpretation. I could be digging too far into this, but does it have anything to do with, like, because I think it's interesting he chose red. Does that have anything to do with the life cycle of the sun and the lighting? Like, how, like, when the sun goes, it would change into, like, what we think would be like we call a red giant.
That's very
before then, like, going into supernova, and then, or I
mean, they are their mission is also to head toward Jupiter, so maybe there is something
that's just something I've always thought about. Again, I think that's the great thing of this movie, like you've said, is you can just get stuff from it, and you can really pick at it, and
it's one of the most open to interpretation movies I've ever seen.
What I was going to say, though, with the monolith is the reaction of primitive man to it, to then when you jump forward to them getting it on the moon, looking at it, there is like that, still like a reaction of caution, but a much more, obviously in the Dawn of Man, they're just kind of screaming, yelling, trying to, more frightened. And then
that's the other big sequence too, is just showing the fear. There's a whole, like, at least 4 or 5 minute long sequence just showing the fear in the eyes of the apes, or surrounding their attack from the cheetah.
Oh, that's right. Yes. The
monolith comes to them as almost a savior in a way.
Yeah.
And that's where I've heard people take a theological takeaway from it, so it's open to anything you want it to be, really.
And there is some things too in it, like there are some times when he makes a cut, even after that monolith moment on the moon base, and then it after I guess they start to hear like
it's when they make physical contact with the monolith. So it's almost like a lot of people believe the monolith to be a form of a test by a higher entity, because it's our entire, like, the loose suggestion is as soon as the apes make physical contact with the monolith, we start to gain
and then you cut
our intelligence and sophistication.
Because then I'm pretty
really
sure
builds towards the point where we're actually capable of reaching the moon, and then when we make physical contact with the monolith there, it's almost like we've completed a test.
You could almost even argue, like, is it the same monolith, or is it just a different one, and each one is sort of the next marker in the journey, sort of like a checkpoint. That it's like, all right, you've reached this marker, now can you get to the next one, and then you just keep going.
And that's essentially what's happening. I mean, they find the same energy signature out in Jupiter, and that's where they're headed. It's just like it's a moving thing progressing humanity out into the cosmos.
So one of the things, I think that's a huge open interpretation of this film would be its ending.
It's as from the Stargate sequence on is just borderline an acid trip, to say the least. But it's also it's not meant to just completely screw with you. It does have points that it hits, but it's very, very, very meant to be take it as you will.
And now I've always looked at it as, again, if you use that monolith as a marker or like a checkpoint, it's the next step in evolution for man. Like, and I think you mentioned earlier that there is like a bit of a hopeful ending.
So it's almost like Hal was unsuccessful in stopping mankind from reaching its goal. So our dark natures in using tools, our tools are essentially, as I've seen them to be portrayed by the movie, to be man's power over others. So his willingness to crush and get his way.
And again, that I think is shown immediately in the Dawn sequence, where the apes with the bones attack the other group, the other tribe, and essentially drive them off from the water.
The snap cut from the bone being thrown in the air to what I've heard described, and it's, again, this is not ironclad described in the movie, but what I've heard described as a nuclear weapon in space is what they match cut to. So it's like the simplest weapon known to man to the most grandiose piece of destruction we can create.
I never knew. I always thought that was just maybe just a spaceship, but
I also used to believe it was a satellite installation,
Yeah.
but I've heard by several other breakdowns that it fits the description of the 60s for what a space-based nuclear weapon would look like.
Interesting.
So it's okay. That's again it's heavily up to interpretation. But if that is the intent, it's a fascinating. But yeah, getting back to the Stargate sequence from the technicals of how they did it is also really fascinating because keep in mind we didn't have available what we have today to create the slit scan view of everything coming at Dave's viewpoint from inside the pod. And essentially what they did was they ran film in an orbital scan against one another and just kind of recorded that off. It was like a weird form of rear projection at an angle doubled over on itself. And it was a completely analog process because I mean nothing else existed at the time, but just they were very simple yet effective techniques like
that they had to come up with.
And I mean the fact that it still stands today is a testament to how ahead of its time it's how ahead of its time.
I mean, it's interesting. Would you even now with the use of computers, would even anyone, with the majority of people, even
we're still trying to get back to this because computers have actually kind of gotten us away from the ability to do certain analog things that you inherently just can't do with a computer that aren't as effective or as cool, just from a practicality standpoint. But I mean, there's still like Nolan is a big proponent of using nitrate stock and shooting everything on the day, and basically the old, as a lot of people will now say, the old ways of doing things. But I mean, there's just so many fascinating techniques in that sequence, and also just from a color correction standpoint, they shot a lot. They took a lot of those aerial photography plates that they shot and just like cross composited them into all these kind of weird chemical baths through the original nitrate stock and just making everything look as basically incomprehensible as possible to a great effectiveness in my opinion. It really messes with your head. And I also think it's worth noting the Blade Runner opens with an eye, and the eye in the Stargate sequence is one of the most iconic parts of the movie. So I just again I find clear lines of inspiration through not only just science fiction but a lot of different prolific filmmakers that are still working today that have really been born out of the chaos of this movie. And the Stargate sequence is by far the most provocative part. That whole crazy journey. And through all like the haunting tone, all of the terrifying moments, the unsettling nature and tone of a lot of what's going on through that movie, it really does leave you in a positive place. Like it leaves you with a sense of hope for where mankind is heading, despite all the bad crap we're steeped in.
Or where mankind can go. Because you would imagine that I believe it's the third time we see the monolith, right? Or just kind of show up at the very end.
That's when you enter into the Stargate.
Into the beyond. Into the Twilight Zone there. But I think that's essentially because at the moment it comes, you think it's the last moments of his life in bed.
The incomprehensibility of the time scales in that part too are just,
it's kind of one of those
really
things where
brain.
You think, it sets it up to be like, okay, here's the end of the story, and then it's the end of the movie, but the story itself, you could argue, is far from finished because of the character's sort of evolution, then again the next step in the journey.
And I also find it fascinating that they return the Star Child, as it's referred to, back to Earth. So it's like it comes full
it does back to where they were.
A lot of people who are put off by the movie always say, what the hell's up with that baby? That stupid baby and that space baby, what's with that? But if you're willing to dig in and give it a second and third thought. I've also heard a lot of people who have come back to the movie after initially being put off by it, have gotten incrementally more out of it upon further viewings.
Well, I definitely haven't watched it again. I think there was a lot, especially now.
I think it's one you need to revisit every so often.
I would definitely agree.
I was fortunate enough to track down the Nolan team restoration that was put out several years ago, and it's a nice print of the film. It's reverent of what it originally was, and there's a lot of great interviews with Kubrick on the bonus material and a lot of commentary. I would suggest if you're into getting a little bit more out of it.
Absolutely. This is definitely one I think you want to watch for the first time, and even if you don't maybe if you don't like it for the first time, that's okay. Even if you never like it, I would say it's one.
If you hate it too, good. You should be passionate about your hatreds. Be vocal about why you don't like it. That's what I say. So yeah, and I fully anticipate in future episodes we're gonna dig more into Kubrick.
Yeah.
I definitely want to do at least one whole episode on The Shining because I got a lot to say on that.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much. He's definitely, like you've mentioned, his influence and his legacy as definitely a figurehead in the industry of not just cinema, but I would say just storytelling. In general.
In general, yeah. So a lot of his note-taking processes and the fact that he would rewrite a lot on the day, and he was a man in constant motion. He never stopped. He just kept going all the time moving. And it's on the set of The Shining, Shelley Duvall and Jack Nicholson said almost every day they would get new pages because he would just rewrite it and send it back.
Yeah. There's if we'll have to do one on The Shining because there's a lot of stuff there too that like.
There's a ton there.
Yeah. So stay tuned for that, guys. We'll keep these.
So yeah, we'll dig into that at a later date. I could go off on that
We'll keep these coming at you
for hours and hours and hours. But go out, watch 2001. Definitely.
Let us know what you think.
If you've already seen it, watch it again because you're 100%. Like, there's never gonna be a time watching that movie you don't get something out of it, in my opinion.
But agreed.
All right, thank you, folks.
Thank you so
See you
much.
next time.
Yeah, take care.